welcome to Kicking It with Sensei, and today we're joined by Jared Wilson. You're very welcome, Jared.
Thank you.
And if you'd just like to give the audience a little bit of background into your martial arts.
Sure. Well, I started when I went to college. I started, my goal was to learn how to use swords. So in my, I don't know, youthful ignorance at the time, I decided I'm going to learn how to use the best swords that there are in the world. I'm going to go learn how to use Japanese swords.
Yeah.
So there happened to be a place in the university town I was in that was teaching an old school Japanese martial arts system. And I went there, I trained there for about 3 years. When I was done with the university, I went down back home. Once I got back home, I followed another thing and actually ended up going more into the Aikido side of things rather than the Kenjutsu side of things, the swordsmanship things. And after I did that for about 12, 13 years, now that I have moved up to Nashville, where I am now, and I'm kind of completing the circle and going back to swordsmanship more than anything else.
There seems to be a big increase in Kenjutsu in the last few years in Kendo, and it seems to have really taken off in recent times.
Well, you're wearing a mask and you're already 6 feet apart, so it helps for COVID.
Yeah, definitely. And do you still train on Aikido, or have you gone totally back to Katana?
So the system I'm training in is a Japanese Aiki art. So it's kind of the precursors to Aikido. So there's a lot of Aikido ideas that are in it. And it is swordsmanship and it is empty hand at the same time. So I wouldn't say I'm doing Aikido because that's a different focus, but I am taking a lot of the same things and doing them differently.
Excellent. And what do you think influenced you when you were younger to get you interested in martial arts?
I don't know, because I never was a kid that grew up watching Bruce Lee movies and all of that. For me, it was it was about swords. I played D&D as a kid. My mom was a well, she would say Middle Eastern dancer. Most people would say like belly dancer.
Yeah.
And she had a couple of dances where she danced with swords. So we always had a couple of swords just lying around the house. Which is an unusual way to start things, but hey, I'll take it. So yeah, that's kind of where I started from. It started with the swords, kind of moved to the empty hand, and now it's kind of blending the two back together again.
And have you trained in many other weapons?
Well, in Aikido, Aikido is weird. Most Aikido, there is no formal weapons training, but everybody trains Tanto, which is a knife, Jo, which is a kind of a short staff, and then a Ken, which is a Japanese sword. But in most systems, there's no official weapons training. So I have worked a little bit with that. I did a year of Pencak Silat, which is Indonesian and pretty weapons heavy on that one too.
Yeah, they're quite involved with knives, isn't it? And
yeah, they like a lot of machete and shorter blades, I guess would be the way I would describe it. Karambits are the little curved ones that come out the bottom of your hand, that type of thing. But they have the same kind of basic philosophy in that anything you can do empty hand, you should be able to do with a blade in your hand, and it should end up having, well, obviously a different effect, but it should be in the physical movement should end up being pretty similar.
Yeah, I'm a strong believer in that myself now. I think with any weapon, really, it should be an extension of yourself rather than, you should be able to do anything empty-handed that you can do with a weapon in your hand, really. So.
Yeah, when I was teaching, the Aikido and the sword, I always use that thing, the weapon is an extension of your hand. I said, okay, you see this? This is now your sword joint,
Yeah. And have you cross-trained much in other arts?
I've read up on a lot of stuff. We had one guy that actually did Wing Chun in our Aikido school. And I wouldn't say I would cross-train, but occasionally it's like, well, we'd throw it up and say, well, how would Wing Chun solve this problem? And he'd show something like that, and we'd kind of work back and forth with that. You know, just kind of, again, never really training in it per se, but someone in the dojo does BJJ and will play around with that for an evening, saying, well, here's one of the problems. This is how Aikido would solve it. How would BJJ solve that same problem? You know, so it's not really cross training per se. It's just kind of like looking at it from other martial arts perspectives, so that you can understand your own martial arts better.
Do you think it's important to do that in martial arts, actually, sort of?
After a while, don't do it initially. You know, if you're, I know they always use the, you know, the designation of black belt as, you know, showdown for it, but that's kind of the point where you think you know enough about your martial art that you can start to look at other martial arts and go, well, what are they doing that's different? And that can explain sometimes why you're doing things the way your martial art is doing them. It isn't necessarily that you have to learn their stuff to learn their stuff. It's you're learning their stuff to make your stuff better, or to at least explain what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. Because I think that's a lot of things we don't explain, especially in the beginning belts, is why we're doing the things we do. You know, why does Taekwondo kick more than they punch? You know, well, okay, well, there's a reason to it, but nobody ever talks about that part of it.
Yeah. And do you think it's important to question everything within martial arts and kind of don't just listen to Sensei, just kind of question it and try to understand why you are doing it? And
again, at some point, the Japanese have a kind of an unconscious teaching model called shuhari. It's kind of like 3 phases of learning something. You know, shu is just, you know, rote memorization, if you want to think of it like that. You know, go do the kata. Well, why am I doing the kata? Well, that's because Sensei told you to go do the kata. At some point, you start to make a transition to where you start to do the questioning, doing, well, you know, I've been doing this punch for a long time. Why don't we turn our hand vertical as opposed to horizontal, you know? And you can start to see that there is a consensus pattern to the way your art is designing something, assuming it's, you know, it's got that built into it. There are some more modern styles that they don't coagulate things together as a pattern altogether. And then eventually the last step of shuhari is kind of freedom from the pattern. You know, it's at some point the kata is no longer a kata. It's just a method of instructing the teachings, and then eventually you don't want to use the kata. You know, it's the argument that everyone uses. You know, well, you know, nobody would stand like that in a fight. You know, like, you're right, but that's how you learn it, to get to the point where you don't have to use it, or you don't have to learn it that way.
Excellent. And I know during the pandemic now, a lot of people have turned to technology. And do you think that's going to play a major part in the future of martial arts?
I think it's going to play a part in everything now. I think there's a lot of jobs that we realize we can do at home, you know, at least the majority of the time. But in martial arts, I think it's opened us up to more, kind of like you were saying, cross training. You know, now people are giving seminars online, you know, and suddenly I don't have to travel to, you know, Perth, Australia to go train with someone. Now I can do a Zoom call and be in this virtual room with them. So I think that'll be a way that it's going to be beneficial. And again, to be honest, if you're cross training, if it's not your art, if I want to go take a seminar in, I don't know, Northern Shaolin Kung Fu, you know, something I don't train in at all, going to a seminar to learn a technique is kind of a useless thing, but going there and learning about their idea of how their system works is a very useful thing. Yeah. So that you can get from the Zoom call, that you can get from the Zoom seminar. You don't get the as much of the correction from the instructor, which could be a downfall of Zoom as far as martial arts goes. But I think as far as kind of saying lectures and philosophy, I think that'll be a really good part for martial arts, is using our new technologies that we have.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot more podcasts now available too, so it really has opened up the community. I know you have your own podcast yourself, and could you tell the audience a wee bit about how you moved into that? And
Sure. So my podcast is called Martial Thoughts Podcast. Let's see, I started in the end of 2013. So I guess it's been going for six and a half years now. Wow. It's weird to say it like that. I had there was originally there wasn't much general martial arts podcasts. There were some that were specific, this is an Aikido podcast, this is a BJJ podcast, but there weren't very many that were just kind of general martial arts podcasts.
Yeah.
There was Hi-Ya podcast, which I think is still available on there. And I liked what they were doing. So basically me and a bunch of friends are going, well, we could do that. And it sounds fun. It was always the conversations after class is kind of our idea of that.
Yeah.
And I did that for about a year with them. And then, like I said, I moved up to Nashville. So I kind of was like, well, I'm going to have to shift because at the time, Zoom, it wasn't the thing. Skype was barely there. I couldn't do the same type of show. So I kind of shifted it to more of an interview show. And then I found out that it's a really good way to internet stalk people and get people to talk to me. When I read their books, I'm like, oh, this is awesome. I want to talk to this person. Well, having a podcast is a really good introduction to go, hey, can I talk to you about something?
Yeah.
And then, it's in a lot of ways, it's really just selfish. It allows me to do that. And everyone else who wants to come along for the ride can come along. And if they enjoy it, awesome. If not, I still enjoyed it.
That's it. It's even doing this podcast now, it's very interesting, the people you can actually meet and speak to.
I've gotten a lot of, I'll use the word friends. Jeremy Lesniak from Whistlekick Martial Arts. He's a really good friend of mine. I've driven up to Vermont. I talk to him, I don't know, once every other week about various stuff. So, I mean, he's become a pretty good martial arts friend, and it completely started over podcasting.
Yeah, definitely. It's like myself now. The guy grew up watching the Karate Kid and things like that. And I never thought I would be sitting kind of on a regular basis emailing Sean Keenan. And it's unbelievable. Even today now I was dropping him emails, and it's unbelievable the friendships you can build through the podcast kind of thing.
And I've found out that most martial artists want to talk to other martial artists. I'm sure, whoever, Donnie Yen or something is kind of sick of giving the same interview over and over again, but most of the people want to talk to you, if they're nice about it too.
Geez, I found that myself now, just as you said with Donnie Yen, giving the same interview. I think since I started this, I've been on around maybe 15 podcasts. And it seems like I'm saying the same thing over and over again, but I can't imagine what it would be like for the likes of Donnie Yen, who's been doing it for years, and it's a lot more popular than I am. But
and especially if it's done by people that aren't martial artists, that don't know the questions to ask. I'm sure that would be, how do you kick someone that hard? Like, well, that's not a good question.
That's it. And how would you usually find your guests? What would inspire you to get someone on now?
I read a lot of martial arts books, and if I like them, I just kind of email the authors, and more than half the time they'll email me back and go, yeah, sure, we'll talk about the book. So, from their point of view, I guess it's an advertising type of thing. And from my point of view, I get to talk to the author of the book I read, and I get to ask them more about, what it is they're actually writing about.
Yeah. Cool. I know myself now, a lot of guests I've had on, I would see comments underneath videos that I've put up, and I would be going, like, that same question keeps coming up every week.
Mm-hmm.
So it would push me to say, right, we'll get an answer for that, and then we'll just seriously, for instance, the most recent one was everybody giving information about you need to know the law where you are regarding self-defense. Right. And I said, nobody's telling anybody that information, so I managed to get a police officer on last week to tell us that information. So
Good.
but it's interesting to see where the podcast can lead you to. Have you found yourself going to places that you never thought you'd go? And
Yeah, I mean, it's when I read books, I kind of read in waves. So like I'll read, I don't know, 3 or 4 on Filipino martial arts, and then I'll read 3 or 4 and I don't know, Wing Chun again, whatever it happens to be. So I end up kind of like doing these pockets of kind of research almost on the subjects, and it ends up being a weird thing in that, again, a lot of it gives you back information on what your martial art is. So
yeah.
I've been around a bunch of Philippine Arnis and Eskrima, but I've never really practiced it myself. But then I went to a seminar with Danny DeSanto was the instructor, and I mean, again, just being in the room listening to the stories is awesome.
Yeah. I think another training with Dan and Santo now is equivalent to about 6 months with most other instructors.
Yeah, that might be.
Yeah,
I try to explain to someone who doesn't know who he is. And I'm like, well, he's the guy that goes, "Hey, Bruce, why don't you try out these nunchucks?"
That's it now. But is there any martial art out there that you haven't sort of sampled that you'd love to give a go?
I would like to get more proficient, more practice with the BJJ ground fighting stuff. It isn't very much in my repertoire, and you always want to fill in the gaps. So I don't have to go in the cage and fight for next week, but I want to be able to do enough to where I can know what I'm doing and not freak out down there.
Yeah.
Which I kind of have that to the point where it's just relaxation in general. But I know enough I can I can not get hit, but I want to be able to get out of it. Type of thing.
The BJJ is very interesting now. I think I've done about a year's training on it myself. And we are clubs now. We've got 9 clubs in the area. So each year we'd have a tournament, but there would be a grappling aspect, a 2 category. And one of my students, I actually taught her all the BJJ that I was learning. So I'd learn it on a Tuesday night, teach her on a Wednesday. And just from what she learned in about 6 months, she went on and just wiped everybody out. It was fun to see, but then if myself went against even a 2-stripe white belt in BJJ, I'd be destroyed. But
it's fun too.
It is fun now. But
I also like I've done a little tiny bit of HEMA, some of the German longsword, and I fell in love with Messer, which is a shorter curved blade. So it's kind of people always joke and say, well, it's a German katana. It's like, well, kind of. Maybe that's why I like it. But I'd like to play around a lot more with it. I've just done a little bit. I've got a couple of books. I got a couple of videos. Got a friend that we're kind of like trying to smack each other in the head with. A couple of messers and playing around with that. Now, a lot of the stuff that I do, Japanese swordsmanship wise, fits really, really well in there. So I want to play around with how much is that the tool, how much of it is the martial art, how much of it is just any sword that's kind of curved will work like that. So I'd like to play around with that a lot.
Yeah, I've personally took a big interest in fencing now in the last while, due to him as well. But the thing I noticed is it's not so much the weapon and the footwork is excellent, even for boxing, and it's unbelievable what you can pick up from one thing that you wouldn't even pay attention to really until you've picked it up.
Right. I mean, Bruce Lee was famous for using, some boxing and fencing footwork because he liked the way that fencing advanced and retreated.
Yeah, you see it now. And finally, Jared, where can people find you online and get more information on yourself?
Well, actually, a couple of things that we're doing right now. I've got the podcast. I've got Martial Thoughts Podcast, which is iTunes is probably the holder of all podcasts, so that's probably where everybody goes for. Even if you're going through something else, it's probably getting it through Apple Podcasts anyway. There's a Patreon site, which is where I put the show notes for everything. So that's just patreon.com/Martial Thoughts. You don't have to be a patron to be on it. That's where I put the show notes, making it easier. And then I write occasional online articles for an online martial arts journal called Martial Journal. It's just martialjournal.com.
That's one of Jeremy's, isn't it?
Yeah, that's his actually. Yeah. And yeah, hopefully, depends on when you're going to put this up, but hopefully we're going to get a physical paper journal out of it too now. An actual like magazine type of thing that we're working on. So. Well, it's going to happen. I don't know. It just depends on time-wise as far as when this goes up. But
I think it'll be Thursday, so around the 5th of May here. But
yeah, so yeah, it'll be just after that sometime. We'll have we're having the sign-ups for the physical copy of it.
Oh, excellent! And it was a pleasure speaking with you today. And
yeah, of course.
That new paper. And thank you very much, Jared.
Thank you.